So we got an interesting topic to talk about today. Cyber defense. Kind of striking this balance between kind of compliance and cybersecurity. So I know we got a lot of cool information to kind of share with our audience today. Anything you want to say to kind of kick us off on this topic?
Yeah, sure. Look, I think this is a really hot topic area for people to be thinking about. More than ever, the government and institutions and related regulatories are talking about, enforcement, and more than ever, risk is abounding, and more than ever, people are having issues with cybersecurity incidents. And so, there's few institutions that are more prone to a business interruptive event than a financial institution as a primary target around finding ways to get access to money or valuable information. And so I'm really excited to talk about this today because I feel like it's very pressing for the times, and I think that it's a tough thing for a financial institution to figure out how to balance compliance and security. So I'm excited to dig in.
All right. Well, with that, let's dig in. So, speaking of headlines and cyber attacks, financial institutions are regularly targets of cyber criminals, right? So what sort of kind of cyber attacks last year kind of caught your eye?
Well, there's some really great statistics here on the presentation. The banking industry experienced a 1,318% increase in attacks just in the first half of 2021. There's a really interesting effect happening right now where more people are working from home, more people are doing their work for a financial institution in different areas, and it's adding to the risk. And we're seeing a lot more people be successful in exploiting through an employee who's remote, providing access into a secure area. So we're seeing success in email compromise. We're seeing phishing emails successfully getting in there and then gathering information to then gain further access to do even more nasty stuff like exfiltrate customer data or to initiate a ransomware attack, all the while doing things like figuring out where your backup is and deleting that. These are all things that are coming out there. An interesting one to highlight that's on the slide as well is we're seeing sometimes folks are having their computers used for cryptocurrency mining, becoming the most detected malware, surging ahead of things like the WannaCry and other web shells in 2021, which means that folks are trying to take advantage of this cryptocurrency situation by leveraging other people's computers without their permission, of course, causing all sorts of slowness and performance issues at minimum, not to mention just having an uncompromised, kind of group of bandits around in your network.
Well, I'll tell you what I think about whenever I see kind of headlines like this, and it mentions a bunch of big companies. I think of all of the smaller firms that don't hit the news.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, if you've got major, kind of large institutions like these that have, huge cybersecurity and IT budgets, and they're still getting compromised, boy, the risk to the smaller firms is just out of control right now.
Well, I can remember many times being in a meeting with the principal of a financial institution and them saying things like, oh, I'm too small for people to care about. But the reality of it, is the vast majority of the success of this attack is through automated bots that find the entryway and then hand it off essentially to the attackers. And that means anybody on the internet is vulnerable. And in fact, as you kind of, I think, sort of pointed out, even the smaller institutions are more vulnerable. The reality of it is, I don't think we have to convince anybody that there's a lot of crap going on, pardon my French, because they probably either have had an attack or they know somebody that does. This is no longer a case where we have to convince people that there's risk, in my opinion. It abounds.
With that in mind, what are some of the top misconceptions that financial organizations have when it comes to meeting compliance regulations and cybersecurity requirements?
Well, I think there's several, some great ones pointed out on the slide here. The thing I'd like to highlight is, look, depending on the type of financial institution you are, you probably have contractual requirements to adhere to some sort of standard. And I think that there's been a period of time in the industry where that may be there, but it wasn't, depending on who you are and what kind of work you do, because financial institution is kind of a wide-ranging area of the market. Some have been enforced in the past, some have not. What we're seeing is an increase in enforcement. So I think that one of the key misconceptions is that some people think they're not going to come after me for compliance, so I'll just do what I think is prudent and maybe not follow the prescribed controls or things that a compliance might do. I think another big one that's a big misconception is people oftentimes think that if you're compliant, you're secure, or if you're secure, you're compliant. The reality of it is the two kind of work hand in hand, but they both can exist without the other as well. And so it is about balancing how much you're doing, say, on the policy, procedure, paperwork side with meaningful actual security to prevent things from happening. And the most ideal world is where you can balance that and put them together. And so, there's a lot of misconceptions out there. Another one I would highlight is I think a lot of folks don't understand, much like in the financial industry, you might have somebody that works, say, in debt collection and somebody that works in securities training or somebody that works in portfolio or wealth management, and they actually all have different skill sets, different knowledge, but a lot of people don't understand the difference. And I think the same problem happens in IT security and compliance. People assume that whoever does their IT also knows how to do compliance, where in actuality, that's pretty rare. It does happen. There are some organizations that do that. I know our organization certainly strives to do that and has some experience with that, but that's actually pretty rare. You typically can't assume that an IT person knows how to even do cybersecurity, let alone compliance. Those are really three different things: day-to-day IT, cybersecurity, and compliance. Those are really big assumptions to make, is say, I can just talk to my guy and he could do all three of these things with expertise. Pretty unusual if that's the case.
Yeah, no, that's great information. Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about kind of a holistic approach to kind of cybersecurity, and what does that look like when it's kind of addressed with compliance requirements in there?
Well, some of this is the SnapTech IT way of framing this. That being said, though, we're really keying off of the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, NIST, organization's studied way of defining cybersecurity risk and defining compliance. And that is at first by putting it into categories. The category of identification, protection, detection, respond, and then we add into it the management piece, because regular IT management still needs to happen. But the reality of it is most organizations have a rudimentary understanding of either IT, cybersecurity, or compliance, or maybe they don't even understand the difference of that. And the reality of it is you might be asking your IT person or tasking them to do only sections or part of it. You might say, okay, my IT management is handled, but do I really have an identification tool in place? Do I really know all the computers and everything about them, all the software that's installed, the vulnerabilities around them, what devices are connecting to my network, which ones aren't? Do I really have protection in place, like antivirus that's effective or backups that work? It's still shocking to me how often we'll do an assessment for an organization and find that, yes, it's pretty rare that they don't have a backup and that they don't have antivirus, but it's also way too common that the antivirus is missing on certain systems, or that the backup does not work the way that people think it does. Therefore, it's not the backup they thought they had. But even worse is, I could say, particularly in small business, it's extremely rare that they have anything from a detection standpoint. People fundamentally don't understand the difference between protection, like putting permissions in place, having a firewall, antivirus, and backup. They don't understand the difference between that and, for instance, like an MDR or an EDR, managed detection and response, or threat detection, that does all sorts of things to see bad actors. And so they don't even know that category is missing, not let alone a formal incident response plan and the ability to recover from an incident. These are just areas that are typically ignored. And so when you think about a holistic or comprehensive approach, you really need to understand, do I have things firing on all cylinders in all of these categories? That's the real trick to getting this right.
Yeah. So speaking of kind of protect and detect, I think there's a cool little analogy that we've used in the past that help kind kind of our non-technical people kind of understand the difference between those. You want to give us that little analogy real quick that you use?
Well, look, a really great way to think of it is how do you secure your, say, your office space or your home? And you really actually put both in place. You put both protection and detection in place typically, certainly most offices at least, in that the protection are things like locking your doors and having the perimeter secured. Maybe you even have access control into your parking lot with a gate or something like that. That's protection. And antivirus and firewalls and backup and setting permissions on files is all about protection. But there's another thing that happens is that you do the detection in a computer environment where you can see who might have broke in. So the example of detection to think about would be like an alarm system or a camera system that can record what happened. And so things that tell you somebody just broke in and things that tell you that, record the activity that's going on is also very needed. And so for your computer systems, just like you need to lock your door and close your windows with protection, you also need an alarm system and probably a camera system to tell you what happened when somebody broke in, or maybe even detect that somebody broke in that didn't use the protection or the protection didn't stop. Maybe somebody snuck in a door as an example by analogy. So there's locking your doors, protection, camera system, and alarms going off is detection. So in computer terms, being able to see that somebody is going around in your network, even if your endpoint protection, your firewall didn't stop them, as an example.
Yeah. And then speaking of kind of holistic, one of the ones that I've been thinking about a lot lately and that I typically see ignored, honestly, in a lot of organizations is when we get down to vendor management and, kind of where you sit in your supply chain and, what vendors have access to your, information, who has access into your systems. I see that as a big gap these days as we, get in and start doing kind of risk assessments with organizations. That's typically an area of, if we're talking about a holistic approach to kind of IT, that kind of sits somewhat out of IT and it's more of a business process, but something that gets ignored a lot when it kind of pertains to this whole holistic approach to cybersecurity.
Well, yeah, I think it's not something that even crosses people's minds sometimes. They don't think about how, like, hey, if I let this vendor come in to, like, always fix this application or work on the phone system or to change our alarm system, they don't think about how that's providing an external company access into your network, like you just took their network and plopped it down inside, and now whatever they do, risky or not, applies to your organization. Or even another thought that I can't tell you how many people I've talked to and they just haven't thought about this. Perhaps you have some outsourced IT or cybersecurity vendors. Really, those tools and the things they have in your environment are incredibly powerful. Some of the largest hacks that we saw that made the news last year were related to IT tools from IT vendors being hacked and their customers being the recipients of it because of how that worked. And so thinking about your vendors and the security and their controls and requirements you put on them is actually pretty critical. That is probably the number one path into a business these days is through IT tools. And so just be very careful and make sure you fully understand and vet your vendors thoroughly and do your due diligence to ensure that what they're using is acceptable and they have good security practices about it.
Yeah, and so me, that's just a great example of, what some of the things that we think about from a holistic approach versus just IT, right? So that's one of the big differences between just IT providers and kind of security focused kind of providers as well.
Well, so I can tell you there's a reverse of it too. I mean, like anytime we're putting our tools into a new client, we have to do it with care because we don't want that client to infect us and then infect our other customers. The supply chain is a very real concern that we all need to worry about in all directions.
Yeah, absolutely. So speaking of kind of the right partner, why is it important that your MSP understand kind of compliance entities that you're kind of, as the customer, has to kind of work with and adhere to?
Well, I think that with the increase in enforcement that we're seeing out there and the increase in fines and really the reputation damage that happens when somebody happens to get nabbed by one of these things, it's kind of a watershed moment for any financial institution or any organization. We're seeing a lot of the regulatories now requiring that you have a vendor signed deal with your IT provider or whoever's doing your IT, and that you're allowed to do things like audit them, and you're allowed to make sure that they know what they're doing. But the reality of it is if they don't understand both your compliance and your cybersecurity needs, you probably need to have two vendors involved, because the reality of this is complex, and having a single vendor that can understand both sides of it can be very, very beneficial. And it's just not something that's commonly done out there. But realistically, they need to have history in the market space. They need to understand the tool sets, the regulations. They need to understand the new technology that's coming out and how it applies both to cybersecurity and for your compliance needs. And they frankly need to understand how you do business so that they can make sure that they're both providing security and providing good performance and good experience. It's something that you really need to do a good job of selecting the right vendor that knows these things about your industry.
Yeah. So are there some questions that you can, suggest that people, ask as they're kind of interviewing IT providers, or there certifications that IT providers should have that you're kind of, as you're kind of doing your due diligence and looking for a good partner, what are some questions people can just ask?
Well, the top thing that comes to mind for me, and this is true, and a lot of financial institutions know this because they're used to doing this kind of due diligence amongst themselves. But the reality of it is to be an IT company, there's really no requirement. You could just decide to sell your service. There's nothing to say you're qualified or not qualified. And so for the most part, when you're working with an IT vendor, you're just taking their word for it that they're good at security. You don't really have any validation, and they can't offer anything other than their opinion about how they operate. And perhaps maybe they can be persuasive and convince you based on, just how they talk about their services. But there is a real good level set on this, is that some IT providers actually pay for third-party audits. Like at SnapTech IT, we've been doing this since 2014. We've been SOC 2 Type 2 compliant every year, and we do that audit every year. It's a big effort. It's a lot of time. It's a lot of money to pay for the auditors to come in, but you don't have to take our word for it. We're being third-party validated for the entire year as following our cybersecurity practices, following our practices from a compliance standpoint, and also providing those services to our customers. And so, one of the great first questions you should ask whoever you're interviewing is, what third-party audits do you have done, and can we see a copy of your report, the publicly viewable version of it? If they don't have any third-party audit, that means you're essentially just taking their word for it, and you have no validation of their ability to deliver things from a secure or compliant way.
Yeah, so I heard this, I remember it was probably a couple years ago, we were kind of talking about this, the fact that there's really no, barrier of entry to starting an IT, service providing company. And one of the guys mentioned that, I live in the state of Georgia, and so I'm pretty sure this is the case everywhere, but in order to be a hairstylist and cut my hair, you have to actually have a license from the state of Georgia. And to do IT in the state of Georgia, you don't have to have any of that. So there's more barrier of entry to cut my hair than to provide IT services. So,
well, says the guy with much better hair in this conversation. I don't think about hair cutting often, but you're right. It is pretty ironic that there's more credentials behind being a barber or a hairstylist. Right. That's pretty hilarious. Good point.
Yeah, it's where my mind goes sometimes, man. You never know. Okay, so let's talk about this kind of case study a little bit, and tell me how we help this financial kind of institution kind of deal with some of their cybersecurity challenges and meet some kind of regulatory compliance.
Yeah, I mean, we have a few case studies we could talk about, but I think the one that we originally were thinking of when we were thinking about the webinar and this content is it's a relatively recent client that came on board with us. They were working with another provider who I'm sure has some really great people involved, but they were really struggling in a couple of big ways. One is they'd gotten involved with a cloud-based architecture that had become expensive and difficult to work with. And as we looked at it, we saw one, compliance and security problems with it, but also it was really like hard to use, just a complicated system. And we were able to completely redesign their architecture so that they were basically moved into a serverless space. Now we leveraged some high-end security tools to do that and some expertise to do that. But the reality of it is, particularly for small companies, a serverless situation is pretty viable, even with the compliance standards. Of course, the other piece of it is like anytime we're working with an organization, we're going to put the best of protection we can in place. And so it's not about working with a specific brand. It's always about what's the best for the customer. And so we put in a great antivirus and ransomware protection. We implemented some new firewalls for their system. We implemented a 2-tier backup system, which backed up things from a local standpoint and also in a secure cloud-based environment, providing a hot site for the data if ever the office space was totally done for. And then we implemented full monitoring, which was a really missing piece of their environment, allowing us to know all the ins and outs, both just from a general IT perspective, but also from a security standpoint with things like threat detection and our managed detect and response software. And then from there, we move into a cycle of quarterly reporting where we provide reports on the types of service tickets that were required. We give them a roadmap pointing out a couple of years of things to plan for from the IT perspective. But I think most of all, the thing that really worked in this particular case is they had a chief information security officer that really understood the value and the need for upping their security things. And so as they were getting security questionnaires from the SEC and other regulatory agencies, we were able to sit down and help them answer that and help them answer it effectively and cleanly, and also point out to them which solutions they have and how and why it does or doesn't fit the requirement they're being asked about. And so from our perspective, it was a real win-win because we were able to help them with their security questionnaires, help them get their cybersecurity insurance in place correctly by helping properly, show how their environment is, and also make their environment easier and quicker at the same time. And so there's a real opportunity to simplify and secure financial security or financial institutions out there. And we had this particular case study we're discussing here is a company in the Phoenix area, Phoenix, Arizona, where I'm out of, was just a great example of a win-win for us.
Yeah, excellent, excellent. So speaking of, my next kind of question for you, talk to me a little bit about our process and kind of how, from start to finish, how we kind of help an organization kind of understand kind of where they're at, kind of what the risks are in the organization, where they might have gaps, and how all that kind of planning kind of lays out. How's that work?
Well, sure, you bet. Well, I can tell you from our perspective, sometimes when I describe this, people start saying, oh, that sounds really comprehensive. You must only work with really big customers. And we do have some customers that are pretty decent size, but actually the majority of our customers are solidly in the small side of small business, 25 to 100 people maybe work there, maybe like on the lower end of that. That is definitely a customer that we work with and help all the time. But anytime we're bringing on a customer of any size, we know that the first step, just like the categories we discussed before, is to actually properly identify what is and isn't in your technology. So the first step of our process is to perform a cybersecurity risk assessment and an IT discovery. During that process, we provide thorough documentation of assets. We look at all the things that are going on in the environment to validate whether they're functioning. We look at the firewall, we look at how it's set up, we look at your Office 365 and see the security settings there. We look at servers, we look at backup and validate they're working. We go through the permissions of the files. We look at vulnerabilities. We do scanning, internal and external. As we go through this process of doing this assessment, we get a really good exactly and specific plan put together for that organization, which then allows us to put together their IT roadmap and their IT plan. We'll propose our services going forward, or if you want, you can take that assessment and go somewhere else, but you now are armed with the information. So you go from assessment to an onboarding process. Typically takes between 1 and 3 months, depending on the size and complexity of your organization. And then once you're onboarded, you get into the quarterly cycle of quarterly business review meetings, IT roadmap planning, and optimizing your IT security. And that's kind of how the process works from there. And you know, we have several different departments, you know, in our organization. It makes it sound like we're maybe really bigger than we are. We're a good sized organization, but we're not like hundreds and hundreds of people in our organization. But we do have people dedicated to doing projects and people dedicated to answering the phone on our help desk and our first response team. We have people dedicated to IT management, people dedicated to cybersecurity things in our security information system. And we're able to offer a rich set of services in a wide variety of areas because of the way we've dedicated and segmented our team to grow expertise in many areas.
Yeah, I always kind of describe it, you know, regardless of who you end up working with, you know, our recommendation is always, you know, do this kind of discovery and kind of risk assessment to kind of understand where you're starting from. You know, got to know where we're at and got to know where we're headed. And then when we know that, we've got this kind of gap in the middle of, you know, our cybersecurity and compliance needs. And then once you know your starting point, you know your gaps and what we need to accomplish and where we're going, then we help build, you know, or build this kind of plan of action and milestone or just plan of action document that kind of lays that out. And so, you know, regardless of who you're working with, that same process would work, you know, regardless of industry, you know, your organization. That's just a great, you know, kind of best practice to kind of follow as you're evaluating kind of cybersecurity and kind of compliance requirements.
Yeah, I think it's a funny thing that we even have to state that, right? Nobody goes to the doctor and says, how much will my surgery cost when they meet them? You know, you know, so what is it? What do you mean? How is that going to work? They have to first determine what is wrong with you and determine what the best plan is and then work with you on it. It's the same thing in IT, but I think the reason why we have to talk about that though is just simply built out of the fact that a lot of folks out there that are offering IT services walk in and start telling you what your IT costs and just say, jump on board and go. Whereas we're not comfortable with that. We're comfortable with getting it exactly right and knowing exactly what we're walking into when we're doing this, and also providing you, the customer, with the knowledge so you can make the decision for your organization, not just rely on IT guys to do what they think is best. You need to be informed. You need to understand it in terms you understand. And that's how you make your best decisions and really control the risk correctly for your organization. So I'm all about the transparency of you knowing exactly what's going on, and it makes it so that we're more successful in doing our job. So yeah, an assessment and a discovery, a thorough one up front, is sometimes a little more work up front, but it saves all sorts of work down the road.
Yeah. All right, I got a couple of questions for you here.
Okay.
So once we've identified our security gaps, what approach do you use to help prioritize those gaps and keep the initial cost down for resolving them?
Yeah, well, that's a tough question. It's always, I would say the approach is at minimum collaborative. It's not like we just say, okay, well, you got to do this. It's the only way. We'll definitely work with the people to figure out how to make it happen. But we're typically going to list these in a sense of an order. We're going to get rid of the high security items first, and then we're going to work on the things that are lesser that can be done down the road. I would say the biggest thing is about creating a plan. And every organization, the plan can be slightly different. But as a general approach, in the onboarding, we're first going to try to cover perimeter protection and security with things like firewalls and endpoint protection, and make sure your backup is good. We're going to want to introduce threat detection, which most organizations still don't have in place yet, but many do now. It's a growing thing. And then we're going to plan a roadmap out for X amount of time frame. Could be 1 year, 2 years, depending on what works for your need to get you there. So it's a constant planning process and then a constant check-in process. So once somebody's coming on board with this, it's onboarding and then remediation of immediate things and then into a quarterly planning cycle.
Yeah. I always tell people, we always try to address the things that have really high impact and really high probability.
That's right. That's right.
Let's tackle those things first. Let's get rid of the most risky things first, and then we'll work our way down. All right, so I've got another question for you here. So how much flexibility is available to handle cybersecurity if we have an IT department in place, and what is commonly outsourced?
Well, so, every organization is figuring out the right mix for this of in-source versus outsource IT solutions. Really, this is a matter of skill set. I mean, like I said, a lot of folks are starting to catch on to the fact that my IT team might already be very busy, and asking them to do a whole bunch of new cybersecurity initiatives might not be practical, let alone do they have the skill set for it. And so you kind of find a mixture of how this works in different organizations. And it's really just about what's appropriate for your organization. Many folks will outsource their IT and then outsource the cybersecurity and compliance management to a different organization because they want to spread the opinion and the risk out so they're not going to one place. Some, if the organization will qualify, will want to outsource both the IT and the cybersecurity management. While others might outsource just the IT and keep the cybersecurity in-house, but that would be a really unusual approach because those cybersecurity folks are the more expensive ones and they're far more difficult to find. And so it's really common to outsource cybersecurity and compliance while you may or may not outsource the IT management that happens.
Yeah, I always tell people it just kind of depends on your organization, what you're looking for. We always approach it from a partnership standpoint. We view ourselves as kind of an extension of whatever internal IT team you have. And in some cases, they've got internal help desk, and we feel more of the back end network monitoring management, some of the boring IT work, as I call it, some of the cybersecurity stuff. And then there's the exact opposite too, where they've got teams that want to handle the projects and strategic things and are just looking for outsourced help desk, for example. So just kind of depends on what your organization, kind of what you're looking for. Yeah, I think we have a lot of flexibility.
Yeah, that's right. I call it, it's almost like there's a bottom down and a top up approach, or top down, bottom up. Let's get that right. In that, sometimes they're looking for their provider to handle the day-to-day grind, take the phone calls and handle the end user issues, and they'll do the server things. That's the bottom up approach, I would refer to it. And the top down is like, hey, we want somebody with all the expertise of cybersecurity to run our network, to run our security, to run our servers, but we'll handle the day-to-day end user support issues on our own, the top-down approach. Both work well, and we have customers doing both. And then, for some customers, they want to outsource all of it, and that's appropriate as well. My only contention there is you should have somebody internal in your organization that at least understands it well enough or is willing to be taught how to properly manage an IT vendor if everything is outsourced. Probably a skill set any manager could learn anyway, because fundamentally, a lot of small businesses don't properly understand how to hold IT companies or vendors accountable. But in the grand scheme of things, you can take a flexible approach. It's really a matter of taste for your organization and budget and how you'd like to approach it with the expertise, because typically more expertise comes with a bigger team.
And in most frameworks and that we work with, that's actually a requirement that you have somebody that's doing that. All right, so I got one more. I got one more question for you. Because we are a highly regulated industry, does it make sense for us to have cyber insurance?
I think that it would be pretty tough to not want cybersecurity insurance or cyber insurance for any business these days. I think that it's a great question. If you don't have it, probably ought to get started on that right away. Look, we don't sell insurance, but we've certainly seen people need insurance. And I would say it's a low cost for a big reward, a big risk aversion. I would highly recommend that people in any industry, but particularly in financial institutions, to make sure they have a good and effective cybersecurity policy.
Yeah, excellent. All right, well, I think that's just about all we have time for today. There is a link right here, so there's tons of other kind of information in our resource center around all kinds of things around cybersecurity and financial financial industry topics as well. Carl, thanks again. Any parting words for us today?
No, I just got to say I love these pictures because people might think they're stock photography. That's actually our own team, so it's kind of always fun to see them at the end of a thing. So, but you know, that's a little bit about who we are. We're real people. You get to know that we really care about what we do, and we're excited to be part of this industry. And look, if there's nothing else you take out of this, just understand that you need good assessments in place before you make plans. It's a much better way of going about it. And make sure you understand the difference of a comprehensive approach, not just doing protection and management alone, but perhaps adding some of the other pieces that are missing around detection or respond and recover, so forth, so on.
Well, if you're like me, and as soon as you disconnect from this webinar, you go, oh, I really should ask that question. Hey, we're an open book. Hit us up anytime. There's lots of ways to contact us on the website. We're happy to always answer questions. So thanks again for your time today. This was a lot of fun. Hopefully, our goal from this is hopefully you just kind of learn something new. I guess we'll see you next time.
All right, great. Thanks, Sean. Take care, everybody.
All right, thanks.